We are in for a treat tonight. Our speaker is Mr. Randall Burbage. He is a native of Charleston who attended the University of South Carolina and the College of Charleston. He's the owner of Randy Burbage Equipment Company and a member of John Wesley United Methodist Church. Randy is past commander of the Palmetto Battalion. He did that from 1990 to 1992. In 1993, he was awarded the Order of the Palmetto by Governor Campbell. And in 1995, he was appointed to the Hunley Commission by Governor Beasley. He is current vice chairman of the Hunley Commission. Randy has been very active in the Sons of Confederate Veterans and held several offices. Among those, he's been two-time commander and chief charter member of Secession Camp No. 4. He was South Carolina Division Lieutenant Commander from 1990 to 1992. He was the Army of Northern Virginia Councilman from 2004 to 2006. He was South Carolina Division Commander from 2006 to 2010, and is currently the Army of Northern Virginia Councilman, a role which he will serve till 2014. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Randy Burbage.
Thank you, Faye. Thank you, Faye. Well, it's great to look out and see a nice crowd like we have tonight. Tonight we're going to talk about the fantastic history of the Hunley. And I just want to start by saying that it's been a real honor for me to serve the people of South Carolina on the Hunley Commission like I have. It's been an incredible journey and opportunity for me. And tonight I want to share the story of the men that sacrificed so much on board that submarine. And it was the first in South Carolina, the first successful submarine attack happened right here off our shores. When the war between the states started, one of the first things that President Lincoln did was to begin the blockade of southern ports. And it wasn't long before trade coming in and out of our ports was severely restricted. So the Confederate government went around our new country encouraging corporations and private individuals to build submersibles to help break that blockade. And down in New Orleans, a group of investors that got together, led by Horace Hunley. Let me turn the thing on first. Led by Horace Hunley, and they started building a submarine in the spring of 1862 that you see at the top of the screen, the Pioneer. They finished the submarine and practiced with it a little bit, and shortly after that, the Union Army captured New Orleans, so they scuttled it before the Army could capture it, and moved their base of operations to Mobile, Alabama, where they started building a second submarine. And incorporated everything they had learned from the first into this next one that you see. Sometimes it's called the Pioneer, sometimes the American Diver. And they spent a lot of time and effort trying to perfect an electric motor to drive that sub, but it just wouldn't generate enough power to drive it against the tides. And while they were towing it across Mobile Bay late in 1862, the line broke and they lost that submarine. Fortunately, no one was on board at the time. And immediately started building a third submarine that you see at the bottom of the screen here, the H.L. Hunley, named after Horace Hunley, the primary investor in that venture. One of the best pictures we have of the submarine was painted by Conrad Wise Chapman, a Confederate soldier from Virginia that was here serving in the Confederate Army. And this is after it arrived in Charleston. It was built and finished early in 1863, but Mobile being 25 miles from the Gulf of Mexico, the Hunley was better suited for a port like Charleston, so they loaded it on a train and brought it through Atlanta, through Augusta, through Branchville, South Carolina, and it arrived in the summer of 1863 in Charleston. And this is a picture of it on Adger's Wharf shortly before it was launched. And you can see that it has keel ballast underneath the submarine that they could drop off from inside in case of an emergency. It had dive planes on either side, controlled by a lever inside. It had two hatches to gain entry. It had a snorkel box right behind that forward hatch that could pivot pipes up and draw air inside by means of leather bellows. And the torpedoes at that time period were not self-propelled, so they had to manually deliver the torpedo. And they had tried towing a torpedo behind a submarine and found that that was not a viable option because they found at times that torpedo would be bouncing up against their own submarine, threatening to blow themselves up. And so they decided to fix it on the bow and manually ram it into their victim. And we thought because of Wise's picture that spar was mounted at the top of the bow, but it was right here in the picture the whole time. You see this piece hanging down off the bottom of the bow? That's where the spar actually attached, a 16-foot long metal pipe attached to that, and it's laying on the dock right here. The sub arrived with a civilian crew because it's been a civilian venture so far. Civilian money has been invested in it. A private group of investors have built the submarine. So the crew that comes with it doesn't do a whole lot out of their base of operations at Fort Johnson on James Island. And well, let me show you this picture of how the crew sat. It took an 8-man crew. 7 men sat on a bench and turned the crankshaft, which turned the propeller, and 1 man stood in the forward hatch to steer. After a couple of weeks of inactivity, with Fort Sumter being under bombardment, with Battery Wagner being under siege, General Beauregard seized the submarine and put a military crew on board. And these were all volunteers from the ironclad fleet, which was stationed over at Fort Johnson, the Chicora, and the Palmetto State. Except there was one civilian on board, a man named Charles Sprague, and he was on there because he was the torpedo expert. And as they were leaving the dock one Saturday afternoon in August, Lieutenant Payne in command, the hatches were open. He gave the order to go ahead and start turning the propeller. And as they were moving away from the dock, he became entangled in a rope securing another ship nearby. And in his efforts to free himself, he accidentally stepped on the lever controlling the dive planes, and the submarine dove with hatches open. As you can imagine, there was a mad scramble to get out of the sinking submarine. Payne and Charles Sprague were able to escape out of the forward hatch. And Charles Hasker, who was a temporary member of the crew, he was on board to have a good time with his friend Payne. He was nearly free of the rear hatch when it slammed on his leg and took him 30 foot to the bottom. When the submarine filled with water and the pressure equalized, he was able to free his leg and swim to the surface, but he was the last man to escape. 5 men drowned that day, and the bodies were recovered 2 weeks later, and the bodies, unfortunately, had to be dismembered to remove them out of the submarine. Well, General Beauregard was pretty upset about what had happened, and Horace Hunley comes back to town, and he goes to Beauregard and says, the submarine is so simple to operate that men become careless in its operation. I helped build it. My men helped build it. Let me take the submarine back over, and we'll soon break the blockade. So Horace Hunley soon had the sub refitted, and they were practicing with it in Charleston Harbor in October, and tragedy strikes once again. They dive beneath the Confederate ship Indian Chief, and the sub doesn't come back up. Civilian divers go down. They had hard hat divers with surface supplied air at the time. Civilian contractor divers go down and find the submarine embedded in the bottom sediment at a severe angle. Rescue operations start immediately, but bad weather sets in, and it's 10 days before the sub's raised. Horace Hunley is in the forward hatch combing, an unlit candle in one hand, his other hand over his head, trying to get the hatch open, and they find that the ballast tank valve was wide open. Apparently, as they dove, Hunley had given the order to dive and depress the dive planes all the way and forgot to light the candle. And as they descended into the water and it got dark, he panicked and forgot to close the valve. And the flaw in the submarine was the fact that the ballast tanks weren't closed and covered over. So if they overflowed in the cruise compartment. All 8 crewmen died in that terrible accident. And General Wise was there from Virginia when the sub was recovered, and he wrote home to his wife, and he said when the sub was brought up, there were knotted, weighted lines tied to a glass jug wedged behind the dive planes. and I like this terminology he used. He said, obviously planted in the water by a secret spy. A secret spy. But General Beauregard didn't want that fact to be known to encourage any spies in the area who probably had placed these things in the water to foul the props of nearby ships, but it had gotten behind the dive planes and made it inoperable, and that's probably why Hunley had panicked. After taking the lives of 13 men, General Beauregard said, we will no longer use the submarine. It's more dangerous to our own people than it is to the enemy. And it has been. But 2 men did help build it, 2 young engineers from the 21st Alabama. They were on sick leave in Mobile and helped build a submarine. Lieutenant George Dixon and Lieutenant William Alexander went to Beauregard and begged him, said, we helped build it. We know how to operate it. We can help break the blockade. Just give us a chance. And they must have been really good salesmen because Beauregard reluctantly agreed, and he said, okay, I'll let you do that. They moved their base of operations to Breach Inlet, a lot closer to the ocean. And about the same time, Admiral DuPont found out about submarines and from spies and deserters, and he said, we're going to anchor our blockade ships in closer than we have been, but so that a submersible cannot dive beneath our ships and tow a torpedo into it. So the blockade fleet, and the Housatonic in particular, were anchoring about 4.5 miles off of Sullivan's Island every night. Dixon's base of operation was at Breach Inlet at the north end of Sullivan's Island here at a dock right behind the island. On the north end of the island was also Battery Marshall, a Confederate fortification with about 1,000 troops stationed there. And Dixon and the crew would go out 3 or 4 nights a week. They'd have to go out after dark with the tide and come back in with the tide before daylight so they wouldn't be detected. So the tide table was conducive for them to do that 3 or 4 nights a week. And they'd go out as far as 7 miles offshore. And the accounts that the crew said they would come up for air and be so close to the blockade ships they could hear the deck watch talking. Then they would come back in with the tide, secure the submarine, and just waiting for the opportunity, waiting for the weather to clear, for the ocean to die down some, and for the rain and the cloudy skies to go away. They practiced on through December and into January. In February, they had a little mix-up in the crew. You see, at the time, there's Dixon, the Army officer in command. There's 5 sailors from the Confederate ship, the Indian Chief. And these guys have come from all over the Confederacy, from Virginia, from Maryland, from New Orleans, from everywhere, from Georgia. 2 members of the crew leave. Alexander and another man, we think was the secret agent Dillingham, left because they had to go back to Alabama to work on another project. And the call goes out for volunteers once again. And 2 men from a South Carolina artillery unit, the German Light Artillery, volunteered. So now you got Dixon, Army officer in command, 5 sailors, and 2 soldiers as part of the crew. And all of these men have a lot of seagoing experience. Dixon would lay on the ramparts of Battery Marshall at night with a compass to get bearings on where the blockade ships anchored. On the night of February 17th, they went out searching for the Housatonic. The Housatonic was a fairly new ship, built early in the war. It was 206 feet long. It had sail and steam power. And that night, it was anchored with the bow towards the north and the stern towards Fort Sumter. The captain of the ship, Captain Pickering, had pickets posted, guards posted along the deck, but most of those guards were on the Sullivan's Island side, the left-hand side of the ship. One of the sentries called the officer over and said, I see something out there in the water. I can't tell what it is. This is shortly after 7 o'clock. So they both strained their eyes and decided that it was just some drifting wood or some debris floating in the water. But apparently Dixon and the crew had stopped just out of sight to get all of their energy together to make that mad dash in to ram that torpedo into the hull. But the Housatonic, see, had steam in the boiler they had a wooden link in the anchor chain that they could hit with a sledgehammer to make a speedy escape. And they'd practiced this over and over again and found that backing away was the better way to go because they wouldn't foul the propeller and anchor chain. Finally, the Hunley started coming towards the Housatonic as fast as she could. The deck watch saw it and fired. The officer of the deck fired a double-barrel shotgun into what they said was a strange light underwater that they could see. Most of their shots were fired at that light. The light was coming from the viewing ports in the forward hatch combing where Dixon was at. The Housatonic slipped his anchor chain, but the Hunley planted that torpedo at the stern of the ship where the hull curves down. And that resulting explosion sank the Housatonic in less than 5 minutes. In less than 5 minutes, the Housatonic settled to the bottom in 28 foot of water. The mast still exposed. Most of the crew climbed up into rigging to escape the cold water, which is about 53 degrees this time of year. And one man in the rigging said at an inquiry after the war that he saw the Hunley leaving the scene, backing away, so it didn't sink with the Housatonic. And later, the sentry at Battery Marshall said he saw the prearranged signal, the blue light, which meant I need to light the bonfire on the beach so Dixon and the crew can find a way back to Breach Inlet. But the problem was the tide didn't change that night until about midnight. And we know that a violent thunderstorm hit the area about 11 o'clock that night. Sentries told General Beauregard that Hunley came back that night, but she didn't. And men searched for her for 137 years before it was found. And we think now that blue light signal probably never happened. A team of divers funded by the author Clive Cussler found the Hunley in the spring of 1995. The Hunley Commission was formed to oversee the project, and after a lot of preliminary investigation, we decided the Hunley was recoverable, and on August 8, 2000, we'd recovered the submarine. We brought in the jack-up crane barge from a good ways off that had to travel across the ocean to get here. And that morning, I was at the marina before daylight. It rained all night, and I thought to myself, what a terrible day this appears to be for such a historic event in Charleston's history. I was tied up next to the crane when the sun came up. And when it broke through the clouds, I said, well, maybe there's some hope. The other thing I realized when the sun came out that Monday morning was that nobody else went to work in Charleston that day. I was just amazed at the number of boats that were out there. Started lifting the submarine up. We had already placed a lifting truss around it and straps underneath it that our divers had. And we knew that this was a very vulnerable time. We had been out to the crane barge and talked with the crane operator on a couple of occasions. And after I spoke with him, I felt a lot better because I found out he was a descendant of General Micah Jenkins, one of my favorite Confederate generals. He did a great job lifting the submarine up and placing it on the barge that bring it home. And you can see this is where the spar attached here. Look at how narrow the hull is. The hull was covered with concretion, organic material that adheres to metal and salt water. You can see the lifting straps here. We secured the lifting truss of the submarine and began the trip home. We had a facility prepared for it at the old shipyard. And you can see we had quite an escort on the way home. Got to Pier J at the old shipyard, brought it in right up to the back door of the Warren Lash Conservation Center and into the tank, which will be its home for the next few years. The tank's filled with fresh water, chilled fresh water to keep any algae from growing on the sub. And we began investigating the best way to get inside. It was turned over on the right side because we wanted to bring it up in the same position it was on the bottom so we didn't disturb any contents inside. After some investigation, we found, after breaking the concretion off with hammers, that it was constructed with half-round plates. And each one of those plates had 98 3/4-inch rivets in them. We had to drill the rivets out, really not knowing what we would find inside, and found it was full of sediment, full of mud, all the way to the top. We got that first hull plate down on the floor, and I was one of the first ones down to look at it. And I was looking at the workmanship on this hull plate because I have a mechanical background, and I was just admiring the workmanship. All of the rivet holes are in line, and they're all perfectly spaced, and they're all countersunk. And a scientist from a foreign country came walking by. He's from California. He came walking by, and he said to me, they didn't have that technology back then. And he turned to walk off, and I said, wait a minute, Harry, what technology are you talking about? And he said, countersunk rivet holes. Nobody knew anything about that until the turn of the century when the aircraft industry came along. And as he turned to walk off, I said, we did. And he stopped and he said, now what are you talking about? And I said, well, maybe you Yankees didn't know about countersunk rivet holes, but we obviously did, because here's proof that you can't dispute. So we both got a big laugh out of that because we were always kidding with each other. But we had to take 4 of those hull plates off to get inside. We started excavating it a little bit at a time. We found the first artifacts on the bench they sat on. And you can see the bench here in this picture. It looks like a 2x12, 2 pieces of a 2x12. The first artifacts we found were some of these script A artillery buttons from the men from the German light artillery. We found 8 canteens inside. We found a couple of folding pocket knives. We found some U.S. Navy rubber buttons. These are those Goodyear rubber buttons. At first we were kind of confused as to why these might be in there. But then we found out that crewman number 7, the next to the last man, James Wicks, had been in the U.S. Navy for 20 years. He was from North Carolina. When the war started, he resigned and joined the Confederate Navy, and he was still wearing one of his coats. We found a little comb inside. This is probably a mustache comb, and this comb's made out of horn. We found a dime on the floor. There was just regular pieces of ironclad plating, obviously left over from construction of the ironclads here in town. And wedged between some of those ironclad plates was this coin here. And as we restored it, the features became a little more apparent. You see the date on there, 1841 dime. We found 8 pair of shoes inside. These look just like the shoes that we wear at the reenactments. I was looking at the shoe the day they took this picture, and they said, look at the condition of this shoe, Mr. Burbage. And I said, wow, it's intact. The only thing that was missing were the laces, but you could see where they'd crossed on the tongue of the shoe. And then they said, oh yeah, did we tell you the crewman's foot was still inside? And it choked me up. And naturally, the crewman's foot would be inside, but after they removed his remains and conserved the shoe, I looked at that shoe again, and you could see where his foot had been in there. There was a perfect imprint of all his toes and his heel in there. We found a ball-peen hammer up where Dixon was at, and an oil can. Dixon's Blue Lantern was also up there, and this is really fragile. This is a picture of it before we conserved it, and you can see it's coming apart because it's real, very thin tin. We found Dixon's candle, and this was probably used for light. We believe that the interior of the sub was painted white to reflect any little bit of light, and also to let them know when the air was getting bad. Up where Dixon was at, I was in the laboratory one day, and one of the scientists said, oh, I'm really excited. I want to show you what I found. And he brings out a little plastic box, and there's 3 matchsticks in it. It looked like, I mean, look at the wood on that match. It looks like something you might find outside today. And I said, where did you find these? He said they were in a block of concretion on the floor up where Dixon was at. And that concretion is like concrete. And I started asking him questions. I said, how did you get it out of that block of concretion? And he had me then, and he said, very carefully. This is probably one of the most mysterious artifacts we found inside. Our government didn't start issuing ID tags or dog tags until about 1905, but a soldier could buy one and have it made by a vendor. And this one says Ezra Chamberlain, Company K, 7th Regiment, Connecticut Volunteers, and when he joined. Connecticut Volunteers. Ezra Chamberlain was from Killingly, Connecticut, and he disappeared at Battery Wagner. Yet his ID tag was inside the Hunley, but he's not in there. So was it a souvenir? We don't know. We found 4 pipes inside. One of them was full of tobacco. The question I ask is, are you sure it's tobacco? They said yes, it was definitely tobacco. We found a wallet inside, and when we opened it, we were really excited. Maybe we'd have some kind of identification. And it's not true that Strom Thurmond's driver's license was in here either. We opened the wallet up, and we were all anxious. Oh, God, we might have something in here. We could identify one of the crewmen. There wasn't anything in it. We were pretty disappointed. But Dixon was dressed up that night. He had a 3-piece cashmere suit on, a suit with a vest. He had a nice pair of boots, and he had some silver-plated pewter suspenders on. And this is the part that goes around the button. And then this is the part where the adjustable part, and it hasn't been conserved yet, but his initials are on this part of his suspenders. He had a nice pocket watch in the vest, and it had a Masonic key fob on it. And on the other side, it says George E. Dixon, Mobile Chapter number 40. We found the records where he joined the lodge in Mobile. When we finally got the watch open, you can imagine it was in pretty bad shape. You can see the second hand and the hour hand and over here and the minute hand over here. And this is what it looks like today after conservation. Our scientists have been able to do some amazing things. We kept hearing the love story about Dixon and Queenie Bennett, how she'd given him a $20 gold coin as he boarded the train to go to the Battle of Shiloh. And at the Battle of Shiloh, and she told him that, George, this is a good luck piece. Now, we're not sure because of Dixon's age and Queenie Bennett's age whether they had a romantic affair going on, but she said she was maybe infatuated with him. She said, George, this is a good luck piece, not for you to spend. At the Battle of Shiloh, a bullet hit him in the pocket area of the leg and drove the coin all the way through his leg. The surgeon brought that coin to him in the hospital and said, Dixon, this coin saved your life. It deflected it off your femur. He still had the coin in his pocket in the submarine. Some people were telling us that story wasn't true, but it's a big dent in the coin right here. And on the other side of the coin is an inscription, Shiloh, the battle where he was injured, April 6, 1862, my life preserver, and his initials. So the story was true. In Dixon's other pocket, he had this beautiful diamond brooch pin, which could be men's or women's jewelry, and this ring that it's most likely a lady's ring. We're not sure why he had them in his pocket. There's been a lot of speculation, as you can imagine. When we got to the machinery of the submarine, we were pretty impressed. This is the end of the crankshaft here. They turned, and then just a sprocket here with a chain between it going to the propeller shaft. The propeller shaft goes back a little ways, and it's a big 4-spoke flywheel for momentum purposes. And then the propeller shaft goes to a stuffing box, sealing box, and out to the rear where the propeller's at. Here you can see one of the crankshaft journals. Now, what was really interesting about the crankshaft journals is there's 7 of them, and they're 51 degrees, formed 51 degrees off from the one next to it. So nobody was ever in the same spot. There was no dead spots while they were turning. And 7 times 51 is 357, about as close as they could get to a complete circle. Up where Dixon was at, he had a joystick to control the rudder. Another thing we really didn't know they knew anything about. And you can see this is the bulkhead for the ballast tank right here. So it overflowed when it sank the second time. It overflowed from here into the cruise compartment. Dixon was in a cramped up spot. The pipe that controlled the dive planes went through right where he was at. The ballast tank valves were right there. And the other pipes connecting the rear ballast tank to the forward ballast tank came right through where he was at. And they had formed this little seat, this board here you see, and it rested on those pipes. And that's what he sat on. He sat facing the crewman and looking out the forward hatch combing to his right, controlling the dive planes and the ballast tank valve from where he was at. And I can't imagine sitting on this little board seat for 7 to 8 hours at a time. There were pairs of deadlights along the hull to let light in, and they had covers over them in case there was a crack or a leak, and probably to keep any light from emanating at nighttime. We've been having to disassemble the submarine because of the restoration process that we're getting ready to put the submarine through. So any metal or wood or rubber or brass or anything we have to remove from the sub because the chemicals would damage it. So last summer we took the rear hatch off, and this is the hatch after we've taken it off. There's a valve here, just a hand valve. When they pump the ballast tanks out and cut to the surface, there'd probably be a differential in the pressure outside to inside, and with a rubber gasket around that hatch, it may be hard to get the submarine open, and so there's a valve here to equalize the pressure. This is the, you can see behind it, that's where there was a viewing port there. But what I want you to really look at, this hatch fit over hatch combing like this. There's an edge here going around it, except this would be the right side. That edge is gone and becomes a little clearer as the rubber gasket that came off in one piece. It becomes a little clearer when you look at the top of the hatch combing. Look at the hatch hinge here. See how nice and sharp the edges are? Look over here. It's just ground away. There's so much abrasive material in the ocean, and the tide was just whipping back and forth up and down the coast. Did it actually ground this metal off, wore the metal off of the hatch combing. And then this is a picture of the glass that was in that hatch cover. It looks sandblasted, doesn't it? Remember we talked about the deck watch firing at the submarine as it approached the Housatonic. We found a piece broken out of the forward hatch combing where Dixon was at, and we found part of that inside the submarine. We still hadn't come to a real 100% conclusion that it was from the shots fired because we haven't found any bullets or anything of the such inside or where a bullet might have impacted, but we know that cast iron, when you hit it hard, will shatter like you see here. One of the most exciting things probably that we found recently was the revelation about the Spar Torpedo. We thought for a long time that it delivered the torpedo and backed away and got a safe distance away, but recently we found evidence on the end of the spar that that's not what happened, that it was fixed fast and bolted on to the end of that spar. And you can see this is a blueprint of a Singer torpedo which carried 135 pounds of black powder, which would be a huge explosion. But remember that all of that explosion was confined to underwater, so there was no huge fireball seen from shore or even from the other blockade ships. And this would be the end of the spar. It ended at 16-foot long spar where it goes into that copper canister. Copper because copper doesn't produce sparks that would blow the thing up. And there's a contact fuse on the far end of it that they would ram into the hull. But recently we were deconcreting the end of the spar and found part of that copper canister still bolted on. You can see the nut here. This is where the original hole was, and probably this tear you see here was probably a result of two things that happened. The concussion of ramming that torpedo into the hull, and then the explosion as well. Just tore that part of the copper sleeve wide open, and you can see it a little differently here. This is where the parts of it are folded back from the explosion. We last summer we wanted to get the lifting truss out of the tank, so we started turning the submarine and putting it on keel blocks so we could take the lifting truss out. And you can see one of those keel blocks here that's adjustable here as far as height. And we wanted to make sure, since we had forward hull place off, that the submarine didn't flex, so we had a laser level to detect any motion, and it never hardly moved. So the submarine is very well constructed. Started taking the truss out and got it out of there last summer. Now, one of the things that we've been really excited about is we had facial reconstruction done on all of the crewmen, and this is what they tell us George Dixon looked like. We had some descriptions of him, that he had blue eyes and blondish hair and a mustache, and this is what he looked like. And this is James Wicks, the number 7 crewman, next to the last, towards the back. And this is the processes that a facial reconstruction goes through. Now, the facial hair, that's all conjecture on our part. We really don't know how Wicks had his hair fixed, but Wicks was an older man. He was 44 years old, had 4 daughters. And this is the rest of the crewmen. Now, what has been really interesting, and I have learned a lot in this process as well, there's a nuclear agent in the water in Europe, and there's one in the water here, and they're different. So if you grew up in Europe and moved to America, that nuclear agent follows you and is still there all of your life. And the longer you've been here, it'll start fading away, but it never goes away. And from that nuclear agent in their DNA, our scientists have been able to determine that 4 of these men were not native-born Americans. They were Europeans. Becker and Lumpkin, and Carlson and Miller. Now, Dixon, we know, came to Charleston from Mobile, Alabama, but he's been kind of mysterious. We don't know a whole lot about him, other than he was 26 years old and an engineer on the Mississippi River. Becker was 19. He was the youngest on board. He was the shortest as well, 5'5", and he had an injury that was conducive with an injury he had on board the Confederate ship Arkansas on the Mississippi River. And he had been here the shortest amount of time. Lumpkin was an older man, 47 years old. Collins was 26 from Fredericksburg, Virginia, and he was a big boy. He was over 6 foot tall and wore size 12 shoe. Now, when you know the dimensions of the submarine, and he was in the center of the submarine, so he would have to get in and climb across all of the crankshaft hurdles to get to his spot in the middle. And he was a big guy. Carlson was a younger guy. He was about 28. Miller was a little older, 34. Wicks was 44 from North Carolina. Ridgway was about 24 from Maryland. We had a nice ceremony for them in 2004, and I wanted everything to be as if we had buried them in 1864. So we did a lot of research on the funeral customs at the time, the funeral beers, and we started the ceremony down at the Fort Sumter Monument at the Battery. Father Parker helped me with the ceremony down there. And then we loaded the caskets on horse-drawn caissons, and these men came from all over the country to participate in this thing at their cost. Senator McConnell and myself led the procession. Here you can see some of the caissons. I even went as far as to research how many men would be in the escort for Wicks by his rank. And there would be a different number for Dixon, who would be a lieutenant. And I wanted everybody that was there as pallbearers and escorts for Dixon to be from Alabama. I wanted all of Wicks's men to be from North Carolina. I wanted all of Ridgway's to be from Maryland. And I wanted all of them to be descendants of Confederate veterans. Here's one of the caissons you see here. We began the 4.5-mile march to Magnolia Cemetery, where the crews would be united, because when the first crew died, they were buried over where Johnson Haygood Stadium is at. When the second crew died, they were buried at Magnolia Cemetery. Some years ago, we found the crewmen, the first crew, and dug them up from under the stadium and moved them to Magnolia Cemetery. And then when we buried these men, they would all be together. How many of y'all were there? Good many of you. What a day. We had most of the ceremony up front, as you remember, and then walked back to the Hunley plot and folded the flags. We had descendants of 3 of the crewmen there and began putting him in the grave shaft that we had prepared. When it came time to put the tombstones up, I wanted us to do it. I didn't want to pay a professional to put those stones up. I wanted us to do it. So we met down there one morning, and we found out really quick that it's really hard to get 8 tombstones in a nice line at the same height. Well, we finally got it done, and if some of you probably have been there to see it. These are Confederate Crosses of Honor. I think it turned out pretty nice. But this is my favorite picture of all. This is looking down the length of the submarine from up where Dixon was at. I asked Kramer, the photographer who took this picture, how did you get all of these colors in here? What did you do? And he said, I just took the picture. So all I did is take the picture. But you can see the bench they sat on right here. There's no insulation in the submarine, and as we already talked about, the water this time of year, in February, it's about 53 degrees offshore. So with no insulation in there, they were cold. The air ventilation system in the submarine worked so poorly that we're certain that the crew was wet, damp all the time. It was veritably raining on them from the ceiling of the submarine. As you can see, it's 4 foot tall. We already talked about Dixon was 6 foot tall. Collins was a little over 6 foot. It's 3.5 foot wide. With all this machinery turning, it was noisy. And it was also dark inside. So they were wet, they were cold, they were in the dark. There was a lot of noise going on. They were really excited about what they were getting ready to do. And when you add to that, 13 men had already died on board. Whew. When that torpedo went off, they were 16 feet away. That's why they didn't come back. Was it a suicide mission? I don't think so. But what those men did that night wasn't duplicated for 50 years. The first successful submarine attack in history happened right here off of our shores. And it didn't happen again for 50 years. If you want to join the Friends of the Hunley, there's a website. We have a lot of good activities and members-only tours. But what an experience this has been for me. Questions? Thank God. I know y'all got a lot of questions. Yes, sir.
Was it true that there were 2 different times for the Confederacy and for the Union? And if it's true, why was there?
There were. It's just it's kind of hard to explain. The Navy was using one time a standardized time, and the Confederacy was not on the standardized time. They were using local time, which varied according to different locations. And so they were about 45 minutes apart. So when the watch stopped, was it set wrong? The watch had recently been wound. And so we think that it stopped when the water hit it. It had to have. And the watch stopped. It looks like about 8:40, about 8:25. So if the attack happened at 8:45, the watch stopped before that, but which time was it set to? Probably local time. But that's been one of the mysteries of the submarine as well. Yes, ma'am. We didn't know where it was at because, according to the growth that's on the exterior of the submarine, it was completely covered with sediment, with mud, within 10 years of it sinking. So if you were out there looking for it, you could swim right over it and never see it. So it took customers, divers, and his equipment to find it. Let me tell you one more question. It ended up about 500 yards from the Houstonic wreck, so it drifted that far. What we're thinking now with this new evidence on the spar is that the crew were all knocked out and it drifted away, and that it took on water from the damage it received from the sentries, and they sank and just all died at their spots because everybody was where they were supposed to be. There was no mad dash for the hatch, and if you're drowning, there's going to be an effort to try to save yourself, no matter what. So to turn a movie where the guys say, okay, we all could just accept our fate and drown, that's kind of far-fetched. So what really happened, we're not sure yet, but we think that, like I said, the concussion pushed them away, they drifted a while and then sank, and once they got on the bottom, it wasn't no coming back up. Yes, sir.
Did you ever find the wreck of the Houstonic?
Oh yeah, the Houstonic wreck is out there. Some of it was salvaged by Malaford after the war, and blown up by dynamite. And then later, a few years later, he towed it about 100 yards north and blew it up again. But there's about 16 foot at the bottom of the hull, still in the mud out there. I want to go out there and get it. But let me tell you one quick story. We had to go to Washington to deal with the Navy because when we first located it, the Navy said, it's our ship. And they were going back to that 1868 bill passed by Congress that all former Confederate warships now belong to the U.S. Navy. Well, the Navy was saying, it's ours and we want it. And we were saying, no, it's not yours and we're not telling you where it is. So we had to fly to Washington, McConnell and myself, and Charlie Condon, when he was Attorney General, and some other senators flew to Washington. We met with Senator Hollings and Senator Thurman, and Senator Thurman at the time he was about 98 or 99 years old, and when he walked into the meeting, I thought, oh gosh, he looks so old, and I hope he lives through this meeting. I think he just came shuffling in, and he sat down, and the thing that always amazed me about him is I rarely saw him, but he always remembered my name somehow. Maybe somebody told him outside who I was or something, but he walked in, greeted all of us, we sat down, and the Navy people were late. And that's one thing about Senator Thurman. He didn't like late. So they were already down one strike when they got there. So he brought in, two Navy guys came in, and they brought a civilian lawyer with them, and he was doing all the talking. So after arguing back and forth for about 30 minutes, the lawyer says to Senator McConnell, well, how do I even know that you people have the ability to negotiate on behalf of the state of South Carolina? And that was enough for Senator Thurman. He got furious. His face got red, and he slammed his fist down on the table in front of that lawyer and pointed his finger in his face, and he said, doggone it, boy. Do you think I'd be here with them if they weren't? Now give us what we want so we can go home. Because I can assure you, I'll be looking at the Navy's budget real close if you don't. Well, a couple weeks later, Senator McConnell calls me, and he said, I just got a call from Senator Thurman's chief of staff. And he told me that 2 admiral showed up at the senator's office and said, "Senator, we need to talk with you." And he, you know how he was, old folksy way about him, country boy. He said, "Okay, you boys, come on in my office." So he sat down at his desk and they rolled out the plans for a new nuclear submarine. And they said, and his chief of staff said he was just standing in the door listening. And the admiral said, "Sir, we need your help to get a new nuclear submarine. We need to get the funding." And he said that he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his forehead and he says, "Boys, I can't be worried about your submarine when I'm worried about ours." And they said, "We don't know what you're talking about, sir." He said, "The Hunley, boys, the Hunley. When South Carolina gets the Hunley, you get your submarine. You understand what I'm saying?" And they said, "Yes, sir, we do." He said, "Well, the reason I'm calling you, Randy, is because I got this contract here saying the Navy will loan us the Hunley into perpetuity as long as we take care of it." And he said, "They want to loan it to us. They don't want to give it to us. They want to loan it to us." And I said, "Senator McConnell, sign it." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because once we get it, you know they ain't never getting it back." So the Hunley's on loan to the state of South Carolina as long as we take care of it.